Okay, good afternoon to everybody. My name is FSM. I'm a water and sanitation specialist. I'm working for the World Bank based in Ecuador, and I'm going to be the moderator of this session. And first of all, I want to thank you, all of you, for being here so late in the last session of the day, despite the jet lag that most of us are suffering from. And well, I promise that your effort to stay awake and your interest will pay off, because we're going to be having 4 really interesting presentations that are going to show us how can we take into consideration stakeholder interest, as well as technical, economic, and market considerations when taking decisions regarding the planning of FSM services at city scale. So for that, we're going to have four presenters. We're going to start with Mrs. Laura Kohler. I think I pronounced it well. Laura is a PhD candidate in Civil Systems Engineering at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And in 2011, she was awarded with the National Science Foundation Research Fellowship to undertake her research on sanitation solutions. And before returning to academia, Mrs. Kohler worked as municipal engineer as well as a water and sanitation specialist with the Peace Corps in Honduras. And today, Laura is gonna present us a model that may help us to better understand which are the main factors that affect the resiliency, the reliability, and the stability of the treatment process when it comes to on-site sanitation solutions. So please, Laura, the floor is yours. Give a warm welcome to Laura, please don't be shy.
Systems to the very centralized, often owner-operated and maintained on-site systems. Focusing mostly on on-site systems, or more specifically on on-site systems, many of the technologies out there do fall on the lower rungs of the sanitation ladder, but there are technologies out there, such as septic systems and others, that are considered an endpoint or an improved solution. And they're globally recognized to be a permanent part of sanitation infrastructure. These are estimated percentages of regional populations that are served specifically by septic systems. And even in quote-unquote developed countries, 25% of, or such as the United States, 25% of sanitation infrastructure is on-site. And given the challenge and funding gaps and the costs associated with centralized collection and treatment, over 30% of new developments are being constructed with on-site technologies in the U.S. And then as globally we look and water use increases, as the connections in water connections in homes increase, the need for improved sanitation solutions or on-site sanitation solutions also grows. And as we start to achieve these goals for universal sanitation, we need to better understand the industry. And you can assume that the numbers for these on-site systems will increase as people move up the sanitation ladder. Unfortunately, as we move from centralized to the very decentralized on-site systems, the vulnerability to failure also increases. And this is supported by research by Scott Weirich, who looks at capacity and capacity utilization of facilities and the effect of those two factors on the ability of the facility to meet some set of performance standards. In the U.S., 10%, the average failure rate for on-site systems, or specifically septic systems, is 10%, where individual states have failure rates upwards of 50%. And while we know that one system doesn't necessarily pose a threat because the contaminant release can be mitigated through dispersion, when we talk about highly dense areas or clusters of these systems that are performing variable, now we're talking about a higher public health risk or environmental quality risk. Furthermore, as we move along this continuum from centralized to decentralized, not only does the vulnerability to failure increase, but so does the uncertainty about performance. We know far less about technologies and management and on-site industry than we do about centralized technologies and management. So the objective of my research is to better understand the performance of on-site systems, and doing this to identify factors that are going to be responsive to regulations or enforcement to ultimately improve the performance of those millions of existing systems, and then to guide decisions about the future implementation of on-site systems, both economically and physically compared to more centralized alternatives. So before moving forward, there are two systemic components that I'm going to highlight. The first are the determine on-site performance. The first is the actual technology itself. And there are a handful of models that look at technological factors to understand on-site performance. And these models are useful in that they identify areas where placing a system might result in a high risk of failure. And they look at things like the site characteristics, soil, topography, climate, hydrology, etc. However, these models don't look at past that point of implementation and the factors that influence performance that are related to the system's actual operation. Which brings me to the second systemic component that I want to mention, which is this user technology interface, which can be further broken down into the demands of the technology on the user and then the users themselves and their behaviors or interactions with the technology and how that affects performance. So the approach that I've been using, it really is fundamentally different in two ways. The first is the identification of independent and dependent variables. As I mentioned, the independent variables largely focus on these user technology interface factors, or factors that are indicators of operation and maintenance. And then the second is the data. Instead of using generalized or extrapolated data, I'm actually looking at real systems and their performance over their lifetime. And this data does come from the US, which I will talk about later. Okay, so the data. Data is a limiting factor for the development of performance models. Unlike centralized wastewater treatment, on-site systems are not routinely monitored. So what data does exist is variable and inconsistent. And often we learn about system failures based on reported public health instances or complaints. And in the US, we can learn about failures or the performance of these systems by looking at repair permit applications or repair permit documentation. In Boulder County, which is where the sample for developing this model comes from, there are 14,300 systems, of which approximately 5,000 systems are not permitted, which means that there are approximately 5,000 systems that are performing outside of some sort of improved standard. And this is in the United States in what we would consider a relatively affluent and highly educated area. Being able to access the repair permit application database, I was able to select 4 systems that are homes where homeowners had applied for applications or permits based on the fact that their system had visibly failed, meaning that they had some sort of septage in their home or ponding on their property. And then I further selected for those systems that had been permitted. By being permitted, I know that each of these systems at the point of its installation did adhere to some technological standards for siting, for soil characteristics. And this really allows you to look at primarily those user technology interface factors. A couple things to point out about the data. First, of the sample population, 30% of my sample were not permitted, leaving me with 150 systems, and that's representative of the larger population. As well, if you look on the figure, the red dots are the 150 systems in my sample, and the blue is the larger population, and they're spatially representative of the larger population. They capture variability in geography. Some of these systems exist in the mountains, some exist in the plains. And then as well, the data captures variability in affluence. Some of these homes are 700 square feet or existing mobile park communities, and others are $1 million homes. Because each of the systems had failed, I couldn't use the one instance of failure as an indicator of performance. And so I looked at the history of performance, and I was able to enumerate the types of or the frequency of 3 different types of repair. Minor repairs, which are those dealing with the sewer connections and the septic system or the septic tank itself. Moderate, dealing with the secondary treatment or soil treatment unit. And major, dealing with the primary and secondary treatment unit. And then each type of repair was differentiated using an estimated cost of repair, which was provided by the county. So this is based on actual data for repair costs. And it's important to note that using those costs is not to provide information directly to the homeowner on what they can expect for a given type of repair, but to actually weight these types of repairs and show the relative difference. So the frequency of types of repair times the estimated cost becomes repair severity, which is the dependent variable for the statistical model. Repair severity for those 150 systems ranges between $3,000 and $40,000 in expected repair severity costs over each of these systems' lifetime. And you can see that a bulk of them kind of exist in this $15,000 range. Then digging deeper into some of the documentation about these systems, I was able to identify a selection of variables. And I didn't list the variables here, but I did list the categories in which they fall. These categories were identified through literature review, and they're significant to the sustainable sanitation infrastructure. Physical state has to do, or variables that have to do with the actual physical state of the system, indicators of age or the hydraulic loading of the system. Organization are indicators of controls or enforcement. User motivations relate to those factors that are motivators for proper operation and maintenance that would be outside of some sort of regulation or enforcement. Knowledge are factors that are related to knowledge about the system, and then also knowledge transfer. And then economic category looks at variables that are indicator of the economic ability to pay for operation and maintenance. The 11 variables were then related back to that dependent variable that I mentioned, repair severity, using a complex regression analysis. The multinomial logistic regression. And this model basically models the risk or the likelihood of ending in one of these high categories of repair severity. The categories for repair severity are broken based on natural breaks in the data. And those categories are, category 1 would be repair severities less than 13,000, category 2 between 13 and 17,000, and category 3 repair severity costs over the system's life above 17,000. And then the model was, the skill of the model was determined using a rank probability skill score. Okay, so the results, what's kind of interesting from this statistical model. In this table, I have the variable and the category which that variable falls, and then its influence on being in this higher risk category of repair severity, which kind of looks at the performance of the system over its life. And what this is saying is the first of the 11 variables that was significant was system age. And what this is saying, and this is perhaps obvious, is that as system age increases, the likelihood of being in this high repair severity cost also increases. And this makes sense. It's the fact that these systems don't have an infinite life. and that we can expect to see more repairs as systems get older due to natural degradation of parts or components of the system. The second variable that is of significance to the model is regulated inspection. In 2008 in Boulder County, they instated a regulation that said that at the point of sale, the homeowner had to have a rigorous inspection of the system, and then knowledge about the insufficiencies of the system had to be passed to the new homeowner, as well as information about the system. And so what this is saying is regulated inspections. As that number increases, the likelihood of being in a high repair severity category decreases. Conversely, looking at sales, which would be before this regulation in 2008, the number of sales before 2008, as that number increases, the likelihood of being in a high repair severity category or risk category, it increases. And so what you see is that it has the reverse effect as the regulation, and shows that the regulation is effective in changing or improving the performance of these systems and decreasing the cost, expected cost to the homeowner of the system's life. And finally, other documented inspections, which act similarly to the regulated inspections. As that number increases, and these are inspections related to enforced by lenders when receiving a loan. As that number increases, the likelihood of being in this higher risk category decreases. And so it has the same effect in showing that this intermittent attention to the system can improve the performance of the system over its lifetime by catching maybe insufficiencies before a major failure. Plotting the results spatially, you can identify areas based on these risk categories. The two plots are the observed compared to what's estimated by the model. As I mentioned, there's a ranked probability skill score, which for this model, the number doesn't necessarily mean anything to you, but it basically improves on this an unskilled estimate for performance. So this model does provide information about the performance of these systems and does well with prediction. But what you can see is that some of these extreme cases, both category 1 and category 3, tend to be overestimated. So the model isn't perfect, which kind of leads to areas for improvement with future research. So in conclusion, I'm actually going to skip to the third point. The thing that I want to highlight is that there is a place for these user technology interface factors in regulations or controls to guide performance or improve performance. And that they should be considered when we're considering on-site technology or the on-site industry. And then the second that isn't actually up there is that by using this expected economic outcome, we now can maybe compare on-site technologies, a realistic estimate of what the life cycle costs for operation and maintenance might be to more centralized alternatives. And then, like I said, this is the beginning of research, so there is improvements on the model, like including the actual spatial characteristics of the data, and then looking at those both best case and worst case scenarios to understand what other variables might be at play, to understand how we can best place regulations or enforcement or develop management strategies to improve the systems that already exist. I want to thank NSF for funding this research, and does anybody have any questions?
Do you have any questions for Laura? Please go ahead. Here.
Very interesting research, Barnard from Canada. I was wondering if you assume all septic tanks are traditional one or two chamber anaerobic digestion-based septic tanks. And the reason I'm asking this question because I see one of your points was how to improve the model further. And the point is, in US there is a variety of septic tank systems. It's not just anaerobic digestion, biofilters, enclaves, etc. And they are directly related to the performance of the tanks, and there's similar problems. The more complex they are, doesn't necessarily they do a better job because the user simply cannot operate them. My neighbor is an aerobic system, he just unplugged it because it was making it functional. So the red dots or points that doesn't correlate well, and like for future improvement of the model, we may want to look at the details of the systems and then how that correlates to the details or the severity of the system.
Let's take 2 more questions. Anyone else? Over there, the lady.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Dorothy Spurus with Iowa. I'm interested in knowing how you translated the risk actually to dollars.
Let's take the last one. I think the gentleman there, right?
My name is Prasad from India. I found from your research, the blue dots are clustered together. What could be the reason? I use several times. Failure types are clustered together. They are almost clustered in various places. Is it what are the factors that is responsible for this? The time factor or any other factor influencing the failure?
Sorry, could you repeat that last minute?
In your data set, I found the septic tank failures. The treatment system failures are almost clustered. The blue dots in your field, they are clustered around a geographical location. So, what are the reasons?
I'm not sure. Right, okay. So what's the reason for the cluster? Well, first I'll address the first question or comment. Actually, originally I did identify the differences in technology, but the point of this was to kind of focus outside the technology on these user technology factors. And you're right in saying that, interestingly enough, the more complex the system doesn't necessarily mean higher performance, because it adds complexity at that user technology interface. And in the US, there are a range from very simple gravity-fed septic systems to more advanced aerobic digestion and complex filtration. But what for this first run of the model, that was kind of black box to see if there was just any way to differentiate between kind of the factors that were going to affect, the performance without looking specifically at the technology. But one of the things that is in future research is to kind of go back and highlight these, at least categories of technologies from advanced to these simpler technologies, to see if that, if different variables are at play for each of those. But in most cases, the performance is, I'll just stop there with that. So risk to dollars. So for Boulder County, how did I get it in dollars, the risk? Those are actually, so each of the systems has documentation about just the frequency of repair and what type of repair. Most repairs do occur because of failure in the system, and the county has kept information on kind of a range of costs for each type of repair. And that's information that isn't necessarily widely available for the developing world context, which is why some of this information is available and why I'm focusing on the US context. But it comes from actual data. But the one thing I did point out was the fact that the data, or those numbers aren't necessarily to date, they come from a couple years ago. And what we've learned is that those values are always changing. Repair costs change. We recently had a flood in Boulder County that wiped out a lot of systems. service providers were stretched and were not able to access or repair each of these systems in a timely manner, so those costs went up. So the point of using this is just to show the relative difference in types of repair, not the exact cost that a homeowner will pay if they see some sort of failure. And then the clusters. So this is a map of Boulder County, and I didn't point that out because I was kind of hurrying through. Those clusters are based around Boulder County, or that's like east of the city of Boulder. So it's an actual just cluster community, it's a neighborhood. Parts of the map where you don't see dots, they are on a centralized system. So this isn't, not all of these homes in the county are on on-site systems, but a large portion are. And so the blue cluster, as you can see, is just a small neighborhood community. I don't know if that was what we were looking for.
Okay, so give an applause for thank Laura. And now we're gonna have a presentation by Philippe Raymond. Philippe is an environmental engineer from the Swiss Institute of Technology that is working now with EWAC, Sandek, and is specialized in sanitation and FSM planning at city scale in middle-income areas and low-income areas. And currently he's based in Egypt, in Cairo, where he's working on looking for those city-scale solutions for sanitation delivery. He will be presenting us how can we better integrate FSM stakeholder analysis into the overall FSM planning system. So, please, Philippe.
Thanks, Azael. So yes, right now we will be talking about stakeholder analysis and involvement, and more specifically about a methodology for rapid assessment and for the key stakeholder involvement in FSM. What's the rationale for that? The rationale is that, of course, FSM stakeholders are now gaining recognition. We see, in these conferences, we talk a lot about manual MTs, mechanical MTs, institutions, but still I feel like looking at the FSM projects that are actually implemented on the ground, very often the FSM stakeholders are not included into the planning process, or if they are included much too late, and this leads to failure. So what we try to, and I think one reason for that is that the people currently implementing the big projects often say, participatory approaches just take too much time. They will not fit within our time frame, or it is too much effort. So what we try to do is actually to simplify the methods for stakeholder analysis and involvement in a format that can fit into the standard procedure of engineering, planning, and design, which means like trying to make it also like much shorter. So why to integrate all FSM stakeholders in planning? Well, unfortunately, many FSM projects fail. And the reasons for that are very often a top-down approach with blueprint designs, the same approach as for wastewater projects, and more specifically also a lack of consideration of stakeholders' needs and priorities. So here, one obvious consideration is that FSM is not wastewater, and FSM stakeholders are not wastewater stakeholders. And I think here there are many more, and there is a much stronger need to involve them in FSM planning than it is in wastewater planning, and this is important for all the people implementing to take that into account. The second reason to involve all FSM stakeholders is to create the enabling environment for the success of FSM management projects. Because basically, very often, as we saw throughout the day, FSM management planning is something new for the city, so the enabling environment is not there. We classify it in 6 components, like the government support, the legal and regulatory framework, institutional arrangements, the skills and capacities that are needed, the financial arrangements, and of course the social cultural acceptance. So you see behind those 6 components, actually you have many stakeholders that are hidden and that need to be involved in a way so that different arrangements will fit, will match the different needs and priorities of all, and for the program to succeed in the end. Stakeholders in Faecal Sludge management have obviously very different needs and priorities. We have authorities, we have households, service providers, and we have end users, not to be exhaustive. Now if I look at those 3 categories and beyond, we see that you have many more that are behind. Like when talking about the authorities, it can be municipal, national, ethnic, religious leaders, utilities, the police. In the households, you have always the tenants and landlords, service providers, could be public, private, manual, mechanical, formal, informal. End users could be farmers, breeders, true consumers. Next to that, you have the donors, the NGOs, universities. So if obviously, as we discussed today, there are a lot of synergies between those people, they have also a lot of conflicting interests and goals. And here it always reminds me of this example from Bamako, where the Faecal Sludge treatment plant was constructed, but in the end never received a single drop of sludge. And this was basically because of a conflict of interest between the authorities, who didn't want to give the land close enough to the city, and the service providers that simply couldn't discharge the sludge very far. So it's important to understand the typical problems faced by the FSM stakeholders, and specifically those of the cities or the country where we are working in. Just as a broad description, basically we have often a lack of agency to participate. What do I mean by this? I mean that some stakeholders lack recognition. It can be, for example, the manual MTS, obviously, very often they don't have a voice. The mechanical MTS, when they work individually, is also often the case. Sometimes you need to build a group or to syndicate them for them to have a voice and to be able to represent them when decisions are taken. It can be also like problems of language, where we have to be accessible to all in order to empower them to be part of the process if needed. There are constraints in the sludge emptying business, and of course the cost of transport is one of them. There is often a lack of resources and capacities, be the management capacities in the institutions, in the financial capacities, etc. Very often there are tensions between the stakeholders that we need to understand. It can be, for example, in our case where usually we don't have very well-defined roles and responsibilities in the institutions. Institutions tend to fight against each other or are not able to coordinate among each other. Next to that, you can have power games between stakeholders, or you can also have a lack of, problems between the formal, like the utility, and informal stakeholders for the monopoly of the business. And finally, of course, awareness and behavior of all stakeholders. And here I just want to exemplify it through this nice sign spotted outside a mosque in Conakry, saying to manage its wastewater and its latrine without being a nuisance for its neighbors. It's a sign of good faith. And I think it's really important for every people to understand that. Now we have all the stakeholders, but what do we do? I mean, which information do we get, and how to organize it? Well, basically we have those main categories, like what are the main interests of the stakeholders, what are their strengths, their weaknesses, what are opportunities and threats that they can bring to the project, what are the relationships between them, which impacts the project will have upon them, and what are the important needs, in particular in terms of capacity building. And this sounds a bit obvious, but it's like just to try to categorize the information. Based on that, there is a question on how to determine the key stakeholders. It is clear that it is not possible to involve everybody at the same level. So the key stakeholders are those that will be closely involved in our project. And here, basically, we try to work or to simplify around the two main categories, which are the influence that the stakeholder can have on the project and the interest that it can have on the project. So like the political leader, sometimes he has not necessarily interest, but he has influence in the sense that if he says yes or no, it can make your project succeed or fail. Whereas interests are obviously those that are that have like a direct stake in the project. So in order to define what are the key stakeholders, we just try to select 6 criteria that will tell us, yes, they are important, they are key, and for which reason. So in terms of interest, we have the activity linked with FSM, of course, if they are potential users of a treatment end product. We have the political power, which is at the crossroad. And then on the influence side, we have to see if the stakeholder has a potential support or threat for the project, if he's able to get funding, which is also very important, like in small towns, and if he has like the ownership of a potential treatment site. This is an iterative process. You can't say at the beginning, yes, we identify the key stakeholders, we work with these people from the start to the end. No, the planning process is very dynamic, and so you need an iterative way, and like it's a repetition of upgrading or updating the way you analyze and see the stakeholders to involve them as closely to the needs of the project. So in every project you have different project phases, you have different participatory stages, and also of course an evolution of the stakeholders' role and responsibilities. To be brief, there are at least 4 main stages where, let's say, an analysis or a re-analysis of the stakeholders is needed. First of all, is the assessment of the initial situation, which is like kind of the feasibility, the preliminary study in engineering terms, the identification of service option, which would be the feasibility study, then action planning, which is the detailed project development, and finally, the implementation stage. Let's see how we did it practically in Sokode. So in Sokode, it was the work we did a few years ago together with my former colleague, Tulay Kone. And after that, we had the opportunity to vulgarize or to put this methodology in a more didactical way in the Faecal Sludge management book, where you will find 3 chapters basically on the assessment of the initial situation, on the stakeholder analysis and stakeholder involvement. So if I'm not clear right now, there you will find the whole thing. So basically once we collected the whole information about the different stakeholders, we did the stakeholder table, so listing the stakeholders and looking at which criteria each stakeholder was matching. And this also in the purpose to be able to communicate with the other partners. Based on that, we could do influence interest matrix, where we could categorize the different stakeholders in terms of influence and interest. This was for the preliminary study. After that, the service options were identified, which means also that the role and responsibilities of the different stakeholders change, which led us to change also in the stakeholder table. So here you see like the gray dots are like items that change. Right? For example, some sites were not deemed appropriate for a treatment plant, so like different stakeholders' importance diminished, which had like further influence on the influence interest matrix and the way we categorize stakeholders. Now you will ask, so what do we do with these nice tables? How do we actually go into action? Well, basically you can link directly this matrix to ways to involve the stakeholders with the question which participation level and which tool. So basically, you can see that if you have a high influence and high interest, you would rather go at the participation level, like consultation, collaboration, or delegation. If it's just a high influence but low interest, it's more about consultation, information, like having the political people on board. Or, for example, if you have like manual MTs, which are very important but low influence, it's more about consultation and also empowerment of those stakeholders. About the tools, well, it can be through a workshop, it can be through field visits, focus groups, household surveys, of course, proper trainings. I will not go in detail, but for each participation level, we have different set of tools available to involve the people as deemed most appropriate. Now, how to include this in the planning process, or what are the most important outputs? Well, you use it to define the roles and responsibilities in the management scheme, to define the institutional and financial arrangements, like this one, so how, like, basically how you will make the interrelation between the different stakeholders. I mean, definitely they have to agree beforehand. Sounds logical, but very often some planners come afterwards and say, okay, now you should do that, and usually it doesn't work like we thought. And also define the training needs. This, we try to put it in a A3 table, but we try to define all the activities which have to be done for in FSM Planning, FSM Planning from A to Z, to try to say, okay, what are those are all the activities, and they are organized in a kind of a logical way. We hope that this could be a help, let's say, for people doing Faecal planning program, let's say, to have clearer ideas and to see also how these participatory approaches can fit into the traditional engineering way to do projects. As you see here, it's really like on the left, it is linked to engineering project phases, and on the right to the participatory stages of the main participatory planning approaches we are discussing. So now to conclude, such methodology, or let's say stakeholder analysis and involvement, of course it is an investment, it is not free, but it leads to save money and time later. This is a simplified approach for quick results. So for example, like in Sokode, we fitted it into the 3 months planning process at city level. It allows to empower often neglected stakeholders. It allows to create the enabling environment for the FSM management program to succeed. And in the case of Sokode, it opened the way to funding to the African water utility. Because once you have all the stakeholders on board, and that all stakeholders are like pulling on the same rope and have an awareness about what should be done in the city, even if it's not right now, then it will help them a lot getting funds later on, or making like a good proposal. And that's what happened in Sokode. It was not right after the study that they got the money, but like 3 or 4 years later, when suddenly the international proposal came, they were ready to make a proposal that was including all the stakeholders from the best. Well, as I said, if you have further interest or if that's not clear enough, please refer to the FSM book, which you can download for free under that link. And thanks for your attention.
So we're going to open up for questions now. Any questions for Billy?
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. Yes, participatory planning is very much important for a sustainable project. And an inclusive plan, to develop an inclusive plan, we need participatory planning. There is no doubt. And a good plan is always half the job, as I believe. As far as I am concerned, I am working in the municipality, Bangladesh. Solid waste, compost from solid waste, in that organic compost plant, it is not operated by their own revenue. it requires viability gap funding from the local authorities or central authorities. As because it has to compete with the chemical fertilizer, but organic compost cannot be a substitution of the chemical fertilizer. In that context, is it possible to make the project viable from the revenue earned by this project only?
Sorry. You just repeat the last part of your question. About the revenue. It is 100%.
Can you repeat the question? I mean, the last part of the question, please.
Last part of the question. Last part of the question, is it viable from the revenue generated by the project? That is, you are selling the compost or something like this from Faecal management. So the revenue earning from this project, is it possible to maintain all the cost, operation and maintenance cost?
Well, we can just quickly answer this question. I think, definitely, composting plants usually they don't bring like so much revenue. So I would say most of the time it is not very much financially sustainable endeavor. But of course, I can't say that like this for all contexts because every context is different. That's why it's important to see with the concerned stakeholder first if there is a demand, there is a market, and then like calculate if within your specific context if the costs that you have to produce and transport this compost can be are not too high for it to be financially viable.
Okay, we will take one more question, but please try to be brief on your questions because we are running a little bit behind of time.
Hi, I'm Maren from Borda, and I very much support this approach. I think we're all on the same page. And my question would be, there are most of the time people affected by a sludge treatment plant because they get evicted or the land is losing value or they're in the formal sector and they're losing their business opportunities. So would you define those affected groups also as key stakeholders?
Well, definitely, as I mentioned, all the stakeholders that have in that case an interest in the project, meaning that they are affected one way or the other, have to be involved because it's not when they are demonstrating on the day of the inauguration of the treatment plant, then it's definitely too late. So I can't say right now how they should be involved in all cases, but definitely you have to find ways to find trade-offs beforehand.
No, okay, well, maybe we have more time for more questions to Philip at the end of the session if we have enough time. If not, you can reach him afterwards. But please, Philip, just stay here in case we have time at the end. Okay, so thank you, Philip. And now we're going to go with our third presenter. Our third presenter is Niall Wood. Niall Wood. Sorry for my pronunciation. Okay, so Niall is a global WASH advisor for GO, who is an Irish NGO who is working in WASH initiatives in 15 countries. And Niall himself has been working in WASH for nearly 10 years so far already. And well, his interest in FSM started in 2007 when he started making his master dissertation in FSM in Accra. And well, he's going to tell us a little bit more about their experience, the goal experience in Freetown, analysis, making a market assessment, research to inform citywide strategy development in the city. So please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so as Zell said, I'm presenting on a survey completed in Freetown as part of a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation DFID funded project. the survey is part of a wider project assessing the current situation. So, for those who don't know much about Freetown, the existing fecal sludge management situation is not great. With the main disposal location for fecal sludge is the pitch there in the top left. King Tom, it's the main garbage disposal site as well, and as you can see from the picture at the bottom, the disposal into that is direct disposal with very little. There's some evidence of waste stabilization ponds that were there in the past. And then a very common emptying method as well is manual emptying, which you see in the top right. So briefly, the overall objectives of the project as a whole was to develop a city sanitation strategy, mostly around fecal sludge management. Also to assess really the commercial viability of management models, including private enterprises. So that's really where this study, which is essentially a willingness to pay, ability to pay study, household survey comes in, is really as a component to assessing the financial flows within the fecal sludge management chain. We also looked at pre-treatment, treatment and reuse options, monitoring and regulation systems, which I'll come back to later, and also capacity building plan for Freetown City Council. So the household survey, as I said, was to assess the commercial viability of businesses, or to contribute to that assessment. There's many more costs, obviously, but one of those inputs to business can be the fee paid by the household. And there are really 5 components to the survey: assessing existing services and their quality and type, their costs, affordability of households, the household's willingness to pay for improvements. We know that the services provided now are not as good as they could be based on experiences from elsewhere. So we wanted to see if households would pay more for a better service, and then also financing options. So the results I picked out, obviously there's a full paper, and you're welcome to, and a report, you're more than welcome to ask me for a copy. I picked out what I thought to be some of the more interesting results from the survey. So there was basically between households a 50-50 split between manual emptiers and mechanical emptiers. Just before I continue, I say the sample size for the survey was about 600 households. It was statistically representative of Freetown across both the high income and low income areas of the city. There was a sample across all of the city sections. And obviously some households hadn't paid yet for their septic tank or latrine to be emptied. So we then, I think about half of the 600 received the full service. Of the households who had their pit emptied, 88% emptied their pit once a year or more frequently than that. So I think the rainy season in Freetown, anyone who knows the city or the country will know the very, very heavy rainy season in July and August. It means that many pits would overflow and flood anyway, so that's probably something to do with the frequency. 60% of households had to wait more than a day and less than a week for a service, which is probably too broad a range to give us enough information, and 12% waited more than a week. It would have been nice to have known a bit more about how it's split per day. According to households, 27% of their sludge was removed from the household. In Freetown, there's a very high occurrence of burial on plot. So 45% of households buried the sludge on plot, and 27% was removed for disposal. A lot of households didn't answer that. I think mostly, well, they maybe didn't know. Nobody quite knows in Freetown as well how much sludge is disposed illegally or does not leave the household and does not reach King Tom, the disposal point. but various studies it's probably maybe around 25%. So the average cost paid by a household for emptying was $92, and a huge range between $19 and $238, which probably is explained by the amount of waste taken away. If it's a manual empty, just taking a small quantity away, probably closer to 19, whereas a large septic tank maybe $200. And there was a high level of satisfaction with service, 70%. We've seen households were very satisfied, and which is interesting. And then, in terms of the improvements, the average that households were willing to pay for improvements, and I'll come in a second to explain what improvements we're talking about. They were willing to pay on average $19 more for an improved service. So it shows, around 20% of the existing cost and a willingness to pay for a better service and pay more. So when we talk of improvements, these are we basically gave each household 6 options for an improved service, and they ranked those options. Of the households who had their pit emptied, 88% emptied their pit once a year or more frequently than that. So I think the rainy season in Freetown, anyone who knows the city or the country will know the very, very heavy rainy season in July and August. It means that many pits would overflow and flood anyway, so that's probably something to do with the frequency. 60% of households had to wait more than a day and less than a week for a service, which is probably too broad a range to give us enough information, and 12% waited more than a week. It would have been nice to have known a bit more about the split per day. According to households, 27% of their sludge was removed from the household. In Freetown, there's a very high occurrence of burial on plot, so 45% of households buried the sludge on plot, and 27% was removed for disposal. A lot of households didn't answer that. I think mostly, they maybe didn't know. Nobody quite knows in Freetown as well how much sludge is disposed illegally or does not leaves the household but does not reach King Tom, the disposal point. But various studies, it's probably maybe around 25%. So the average cost paid by a household for emptying was $92, and a huge range between $19 and $238, which probably is explained by the amount of waste taken away. If it's a manual emptier, just taking a small quantity away, probably closer to 19, whereas a large septic tank is maybe over $200. And there was a high level of satisfaction with service of 70%. We've seen households were very satisfied, and which is interesting. And then, in terms of the improvements, the average that households were willing to pay for improvements, and I'll come in a second to explain what improvements we're talking about. They were willing to pay on average $19 more for an improved service. So it shows, around 20% of the existing cost and a willingness to pay for a better service and pay more. So when we talk of improvements, these are we basically gave each household 6 options for an improved service, and they ranked those options from 1 to 6. And basically, the pit emptier can be contacted more easily and is able to, do the job more properly because of that. That when they are contacted, that they turn up on time and they do the job at a convenient time of day. That they do the job hygienically and don't create a mess. That they take the waste out of the household's own compound. And then the next one was that they take the waste out of the wider community and wider neighborhood. And finally was that the waste is disposed of safely and is used and is maybe treated and be used, but at least that it's disposed of in a safe and responsible way. So So the ranking, this is basically all the households ranked from 1 to 6, and this is the average, once we average the scores, the number one improvement was around being contactable, that the households the service providers could be easily contacted, and that when they were, they turned up on time. The third ranking was that the waste made it out of the compound, that it was removed. And then fourth, that if the service was clean. Second to last was that the waste made it out of the community, which maybe in an urban area, households are less concerned about waste leaving the communities or their own household. And finally, that it's safely disposed of. And then we also asked about payment options. This is interesting results because they don't match really, but 89% of households were satisfied with their current payment method. And it was about a 50-50 split between those who paid in lump sum and those who paid in installment. And 89% of households needed payments to be flexible. However, half of them paid in lump sum, but they were certainly expressing in focus group discussions that they needed the payments to be flexible to fit with variable income levels. We also asked about sort of estimated annual incomes, mostly around the how much people pay for other services and on other products. And we found that we estimate that the cost of emptying is about 1.8% of annual income. And I think there was a study done several years ago where it was stated that fecal sludge management expenditure should be about 0.5% of income. So we're clearly over that. So this was the phase 1 project of the Gates grant. I don't have time to really go into this in great detail, but we then looked at how the results from this survey, along with other information streams, focus group discussions, and stakeholder interviews, would inform us on how we should design the system in Freetown. And I suppose these are the sort of, in the lower income areas, we determined that obviously we would need transfer stations for these areas to get the waste out, and we determined that I think about 40% of the sections in Freetown would require transfer stations based on population density and accessibility by vacuum tankers. And then there were these households who could be serviced by vacuum tankers directly. And then they would all have to go to ideally to a sort of disposal or dewatering point before going to final disposal. And overall, this Freetown City Council, we needed to develop more of a sanitation unit, and they would also operate a contact centre to enable improved competition similar to the project in Dhaka. So, for those who don't know Freetown, this is the sort of Freetown Peninsula with the city at the northern point, and at the most southern point there's a private company in Freetown who have a contract to manage all of the waste in Freetown, and they have land in the south of the peninsula to construct a treatment facility. This probably takes about 1 hour, 1.5 hours to transport waste, so we determined that this red dot is the existing treatment location, and that we would, if we created more of a dewatering facility or pre-treatment facility in that location, we might be able to transport that waste to the treatment facility or the treatment facility more efficiently. And also, this is how we determine the location of transfer stations in these separate sections. And under our phase 2 proposal, we determined, well, that 12 more transfer stations would be required, but we would also need to construct more in the future. And then this is about like how those transfer stations were, the plan to manage those transfer stations was to basically the companies who operate as vacuum tanker companies in the city would work on a performance-based contract issued by Freetown City Council. They would be responsible for one or several transfer stations, and they would then link with the manual pit emptying groups that already exist in Freetown and work quite a large number, they would basically become, the tanker company would become the contact point to the household. So that should help to address the promptness of service and also the ability to be contacted. And then the vacuum tanker company would then lease improved equipment such as a gulper or a evac or trash pump to the manual emptying group for that to carry out their task. And the money from the household would go to the vacuum tanker company. They would basically subcontract the manual empties. So the idea of this is that then the company in charge of that transfer station would be responsible to empty that and to move it then to the point of disposal. So yeah, there's lots of other interesting interactions, and we were considering the financial flows through the system. We needed to estimate what the cost of running these transfer stations was, but obviously there aren't that many. The goal was built with DFID funding under the Freetown Wash Consortium, has constructed 3 different types of transfer station, and on Thursday afternoon in workshop 2 we'll go through a sort of a workshop there and part of that will be to run through these types of design that we've used and how they affect the costs of running fecal sludge service. And as part of that project, the phase 2 project design, the proposal was done with Dalberg and Wilson. We were aiming to really leverage the relationships between the 3 groups, with Freetown City Council being the key public sector partner, but also that they would have a fecal, well, I called it a fecal sludge management unit there, but we did call it a sanitation unit within Freetown City Council. That the service providers, and that's the vacuum tanker companies and the manual pit entities, they're sort of representing the private sector, and also Masada, who are the company responsible for the large treatment plant in the south of the region. And then communities and households, and between the implementing agencies, we would be responsible for leveraging these 3 components. With goal responsible with sort of working with civil society, building up their knowledge of the fecal sludge management services that they're able to, or that they're able to access, and what the responsibilities of Freetown City Council are, and the sanitary inspectors. And make people more aware that, if a quarter of people don't know where the fecal sludge goes, we should make them aware of where it should go, and I think there's maybe an education sort of gap maybe in that one. The final slide. Yeah. So the 3 lessons, maybe not the top 3, but 3 lessons to come out. One was that the estimating accurate financial flows is quite difficult. As I said, there's not really, if you don't have a transfer station already in use, you don't really know what the costs involved are. There's probably, and without any final reuse facility where they're actually treating sludge and creating a byproduct for sale, it's very hard to know what people will pay for that product before the product exists. So it's quite hard to predict financial flows. Also with that, the civil society feedback, I think there's progress made in the health sector on citizen report cards and things like this, and also the water sector, but how do communities feed back on the situation in their area? Can they report illegal emptying of them? And also that citywide sanitation plan development is a real challenge. And so we were told to write a phase 2 proposal that we actually broke into 5 phases. And the way forward for the project, we obviously continue to seek funding for the phase 2 proposal, and I think that the major area of focus should be on Freetown City Council, the establishment of a sanitation unit or a fecal sludge management unit. It's not low down on government priorities, but it needs more support. And also, obviously, the Ebola outbreak situation in Sierra Leone has slowed the progress of our work, but we hope that in the next weeks and months that situation is. So, thank you very much.
Time for questions. So Peter, here at the front.
Yeah, no, your penultimate slide showing that triangular arrangement of the public and the service provider and the, that one, yeah, and the public sector. It reminds me very much of a slide that the regulator in Mozambique uses to explain what the regulator does. And the regulator sits in the middle there, where you've got Goal and Mossad and Dalberg. And I think it just struck me. I mean, you said that you were trying to engender some civil society involvement, and I can see that kind of running in the same direction. It was just an observation that you might think about regulation in that little circle instead of you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea really is that the regulation comes from Freetown City Council, or at least some public sector body, maybe. I suppose that the sort of dashed arrows are trying to show like the influence of the program and between the different agent or organisations involved, that we had our aims of to say Dalberg to improve the private sector or to help strengthen the private sector and for support to the institutions, and then really between the private and public sectors, the public sector's responsibility is regulation. Yeah, maybe we should make ourselves less central.
Ms. Hassi from the sector program, Sustainable Sanitation, PSF. Just a very simple question. Did you ever consider balancing the volumes that are transported? You had a sample of 600 households, and did you look at the number of trucks or the volume that comes to the Masada? So you have a possibility to just check how much of the fecal sludge volume is lost on the way.
Yeah. So the Masada site is not actually open yet. That's sort of a work in progress, but the King Tom location where the trucks would go to. So we did begin to count trucks into King Tom, but it started to create some issues with the truck drivers. What we do know though is that we know how many trucks operate in Freetown. We know roughly how many trips they do per day, and we know that they don't all go to King Tom for sure. And even if it does, the waste then just flows into the sea really through the sort of poorer communities. So yeah, I mean, if we were able to do more of a detailed assessment over a longer period of time, we would be able to determine if they did. But also with the amount of manual emptying, like we obviously doesn't account for that. At the moment, there's no way for the manual emptiers to get their waste from when they do their job into a vacuum tanker truck to go to King Tom. So if they don't bury on site, or they can't bury on site, then it does go directly into the drain or a stream.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Nice. Okay, let's thank Neil. And now we go with our last presenter, Ruth Kennedy Walker. Ruth is a PhD candidate in environmental engineering at the University of Newcastle. She is also a master in civil engineering, and before her PhD, she has been working as a civil engineer and wastewater management industry in the UK. And Ruth is going to give us a presentation on how life cycle costs of different FSM alternatives may be calculated and taken into the planning and the strategic development. Please, Ruth.
Thank you. Must have done something really bad to be the last presentation today. I'll try and keep you all awake. Okay, so yes, my name is Ruth Kennedy Walker. I'm going to present on part of my PhD research, which I'm just coming to the end of now. So, which is looking specifically at FSM and how we might improve planning for fecal sludge management specifically in the city of Lusaka in Zambia. So Lusaka is the capital of Zambia. It has a population of around 2.2 million. And it has a population growth rate of around 4.7%, with the majority of the growth happening in low-income informal settlements. This map nicely shows the different areas within Lusaka, and the coloured polygons are those low-income areas, which I'm going to call informal settlements, which have developed to avoid planning regulations, and are very standard. I think most people know what those types of settlements look like. The other areas are more planned areas, and they often have more middle and high-income inhabitants. On the map, we show the conventional sewage system that was built in Lusaka in the 1960s, and what we can clearly see is the majority of the city are not served by the conventional sewage system. So those people living in those residents of middle and high income status, a lot of them are served by on-site systems, particularly septic tanks. And when they become full, there are around 30 companies available in Lusaka to empty and discharge into Manchinchini, which is the main treatment works. The story is a little bit different for the low-income areas. These areas are not served by those more formalised emptying services, and typically a similar story occurred, manual emptying with indiscriminate dumping of waste in the local environment. So Lusaka, because of the hydrogeological situation, it is very vulnerable to groundwater pollution. And this graph shows the polygons on here are the informal settlements that were on the previous slide. And what we see is a lot of those informal settlements are allowed in these areas of high vulnerability to groundwater pollution. Now, what I should have said, so in the informal settlements, the majority of households use pit latrines. These are of varying quality of construction, but the majority of them are single pit latrines, unlined and open bottomed, which is standard. But obviously in a situation where you've got a hydrogeological situation where the groundwater is very vulnerable, this can cause a problem, and we get a lot of waterborne diseases commonly occurring in Lusaka every year. So, when I was starting my research, which was obviously a little while ago now, I looked at the situation, and some of the work that was being done, but which is still continuing to be done on fecal sludge management by USUP, which was funded by the Stone Foundation, with support of Border as well, shows that fecal sludge management could provide a feasible solution, which was being shown through a pilot study that was being implemented in an area called Kanyama. The challenge now is to move from the pilot scale, which that very much was, to a citywide scale, and how do we support the development of fecal sludge management at the citywide scale for low-income informal settlements. So this work as part of my PhD was really to try and develop a decision support tool, because at the time of when I was doing this work, I was looking at literature. There wasn't much financial information, there wasn't many decision support tools. I know we've heard of some today, but they've obviously been developed in the meantime, so some of them are obviously going to be better than what I've produced, but it's still a different type of model. So what the model actually aimed to do was to compare various fixed infrastructure scenarios for fecal sludge management and different transportation options, so particularly for the primary transportation within the informal settlements. So I compared two options using manual transportation, such as manual carts, and vacuum tug Mark II, which is a standard. There's other technologies out there, but they're the two I use for my model and this tool. And the idea was to reduce the long-term costs associated with fecal sludge management systems over a 25-year design period life. So the methodology. So when I was doing my research, I noticed that a lot of literature said that the transportation component of fecal sludge management is very important. So that was something I wanted to concentrate on. So within the methodology, I used a kind of novel spatio-topological model to optimize the transportation network. I'll talk more about that in the next slide. I also looked at optimization of the containment design and how that would affect the long-term costs. And these were put in, not very nifty, but into an Excel spreadsheet, because that was the easiest way of doing it. And the outputs, as I say, the 25-year design period, design life were in net present value and average incremental cost per metre cubed of sludge removed. Okay, so the spatio-topological methodology. So some colleagues of mine, we have we have a very good geotechnical department within my university, and they had produced this model, this spatio-topological model, and we're using it in high-income countries such as the UK. So this is what they were using. It was a Python interface coupled with a Network X graph analysis package, which is jargon to me. But what it meant, they were using it in the UK to try and optimise transportation distance based on time, by using inputting distance and speed, and that would then help them to determine and optimise time. So through discussion with colleagues, I realised this would be a really nifty tool for fecal sludge management, because transportation, if you can reduce the time and optimise the time, that will obviously impact your costs. So this was the initial kind of proof of concept idea that we conducted in Nairobi in Kenya, in Kibera, one of the areas there. And what we were trying to do was, we knew our collection points, we selected using a multi-criteria analysis where possible transfer stations could be located and the endpoint. And the model allowed us to work out, well, what are the optimum single and multiple transfer station locations based on those distances. So we built the networks. We had obviously the collection point, the road network, all the different possible routes that the truck could go. We had the transfer station locations and the endpoint, and that allowed us to work out, based on time, the least time networks. So I should say that between the collection point and the transfer station, we modelled manual and back it up. And from the transfer station to the endpoint, we modelled using the vacuum tanker, which is much higher volume. So we did this in, as I say, in Kibera. We showed that the concept worked. So then we moved on, how could I use this in Lusaka, where the data, I should say that the Kibera project, we chose that because data was very readily available. There was a widespread crowdsourced mapping initiative through the NGO Map Kibera, which was really useful because it gave us all the information that was to hand, so that would allow us to, with good data, to see whether this proof of principle of using this model would work. In Lusaka, the situation is a little bit different, so I wanted to see, will it work in a different context? And as I said, I looked at the cost of the situation using different fixed infrastructure scenarios. So one was a wholly decentralised, so where the fecal sludge would be transported to a treatment system within the community. Second one would be via transfer station and then onward to a sewage discharge station, which would connect to the existing conventional sewage system. And another option was directly to this centralised treatment system from the community to the centralised treatment system. So in Lusaka, I went in good blazing, thought, right, there's got to be all this data, and there wasn't much. So then it meant that I had to really dig around, and a lot of, there's a lot, this model is in no way perfect, but that's because a lot of the data just wasn't there, so I had to make a lot of assumptions. What was there was, so things like individual household locations, they're just not there, the toilets, even the road pathway networks aren't there for Lusaka, but there was good information on water distribution networks, so we allowed, often those pipes lie along roads, we were able to use that as an initial and then verify it using Google Maps. And so yeah, so that's all the data we used. So this was eventually the network that was developed. Sorry, I should say that we didn't do it for all informal settlements in Lusaka, we just chose 2 specific ones where we've been doing other work. And this was the built infrastructure that we were able to use to identify the optimum transfer station, the single and multiple transfer stations for the 3 fixed infrastructure scenarios. Okay, so then the output of the spatial topological model then went into this Excel spreadsheet that had been developed, which aligned costs to each part of the network. I should say that the upfront containment, building of the containment was not included because that was unanimous throughout each of the models, and the reuse element was also not included. So the results showed that most of the options that I modelled were deemed affordable based on assumption that 0.5% of income could be spent on sanitation. What we showed was that the motorised options were actually cheaper than the manual ones to have modelled, and that was because obviously the motorised options have a much higher volume capacity, they're quicker, all those kind of things. So it meant that you needed less of those equipment and you needed less team to work alongside that equipment. Also what was shown was we were able to show that the proportion of costs associated with different parts of the network, and what was shown was the internal transportation, it did have a high influence on the overall cost, and so did discharge fee downstream of the treatment. So with the spatio-topological model and the optimisation of transfer stations, it showed that the use of multiple transfer stations did actually reduce the transportation distance requirement between the collection point and the transfer station onwards to the endpoint. But the scenarios with multiple transfer stations did overall have higher costs. And the reason for this was because the capital and operation costs associated with having multiple transfer stations were higher than the saving made by reducing that transportation distance. Okay, so limitations and further work. So I think one of the big things was just the lack of basic information. This is, I think we've heard about it throughout the day today. The quality and the amount of information in these informal settlements. So, what does the containment system look like? How, the volume of it, where is it located, where are households located, what are the road systems, all that information just wasn't there. So, obviously, if you haven't got that information, you then can't understand your emptying frequency, accumulation rate, your emptying frequency, the distance, the speeds, all those things. So you really need to work hard to get that information. More attention, I think a lot of, when I was reading, I felt that a lot of I think it is shifting now, but a lot of the information was on kind of counting toilets and kind of, focus on the reuse, the end use, but actually the containment part of the chain and the transportation are very important, and especially what I've shown in my work is especially to the cost, because if you don't understand how much storage you've got and how you're going to transport it and the cost of that, then it will affect the overall cost of any system implemented. Again, in-depth and longitudinal data, so obviously to get that information on containment facilities and where they're located, it will take a lot of work. You're going to have to, especially for a city the size of SuSanA, where 70% of the population live in such informal settlements, it's going to be a lot of data collection. I think the tools, I think they're helpful. Well, when I started the work, there wasn't anything out there for SuSanA anyway, to be able to support scale up of such systems. So, but then I think these tools can definitely be used more in reality. So I think the presentation we had before this from the guys at SEPT, they're actually doing it, working with municipalities and actually getting them to collect the data. I think that's the next step for this. And also maybe beyond FSM for other road-based systems. I think that's. So I just want to thanks for listening and some acknowledgements, because I should acknowledge my supervisors, because obviously Hanoi and Charlotte Austin. Collaborations at the university with Thomas Holness, David Olson, and also Barbara Evans, who quite a lot of you know has had a lot of input, especially early on in the model development. What's up for being gatekeepers within SuSanA, EPSRC funding, and then SuSanA Water and Sewage Company for a lot of their time and information. If anybody wants to talk to me more about the model, the spatial topological model to optimise transfer stations is open source. So if anyone wants to know where they can get that, or is interested in learning more about what I've done, if it hasn't been clear in the presentation, then please come and see me afterwards. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. We may take a couple of questions specifically for this last presentation, and then we will also open to all of the topics that have been discussed. So please, over there.
Thank you very much, Ruth. My name is Darryl Jackson, consultant. I'm on the edge of my seat to know not so much about the model that you're very enthusiastic about, but the big picture decision making in Lusaka for those areas, where you said on your slide that fecal sludge management in those areas was one of the solutions. And I'm on the edge of my seat to know, the obvious other solution is to say, let it continue to pollute the groundwater and to make these people less reliable on the polluted groundwater and bring in another source. Do you know what the options there and how the fecal sludge management options compare to other sort of non-fecal sludge management options to address the public health problem?
Was another question over there?
Yeah, Pierre Flamand from the Japan Sanitation Consortium. I wanted to ask you, because obviously you were very fond of the multi-transfer station, which I also think is a very good solution, especially in developing countries where you have a problem with traffic congestion, for example. I wanted to ask you about the social acceptance, because I think in cities nobody wants to have a kind of facility near his house. So this aspect I wanted to ask you about.
Maybe a third one? That's it by the moment.
Okay. So the first question, hopefully I get what you were trying to say. I think the Millennium Challenge account have produced a huge sanitation master plan for Lusaka, and within that they focus very much, because there is a conventional sewage system that's there, but obviously it's over time it's been neglected, so there's a lot of money needs to be spent on upgrading that or getting that system to where it needs to be. And within that funding, they've also allocated a certain amount for informal areas. But I think there's such a huge amount of investment needed for the centralised sewage that master plan focuses on. I don't think the only other options I've seen in Lusaka, so there's FSM and then the World Bank funded a condominium system in another low-income area called Kalingalinga. So I think at the moment they're the kind of two things that have been trialled. EcoSam was trialled a while back with mixed reviews in these areas, but I think at the moment I got the impression from discussions with the Lusaka Water and Sewerage Company that they're trialling these two types of fecal sludge management and the condominial, and they're really going to see then, how effective and how well those systems work. And then the next stage will be to, for each individual low income or informal area, which try and work out between those types of systems what would be most viable. And then obviously some of those areas, once the centralised sewer is expanded and upgraded, some of those areas will be connected to a centralised sewer. I don't know whether that answers your question. If not, then maybe...
My question was a non-sanitation. My question was related about a non-sanitation solution to the problem. In other words, water supply.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Well, the water supply... you mean in terms of the public health? Sorry. I think that the water supply in recent times in these informal settlements has improved dramatically through the water trusts that were created around maybe 10, 15 years ago. But I think people are still, because the water supply is not completely adequate, sometimes it goes off and there's electricity supply and all those problems. So I think people are still using the shallow wells for water usage. So I think there's a need still to improve upon the water supply systems in those settlements. But I still think the sanitation, the status of the on-site systems at the moment, there's no guidance, there's no technical guidance out there. They're just the containment needs to be also looked at as well as water supply. And the second question, I think so the project with WUSUP, which is actually running in Kanyama, they haven't used, or they may be using, but when I was there, they hadn't used transfer stations. So I don't think the problem with social acceptance has really come about just yet. sorry, but I think, yeah, that's obviously, that would be an issue. It was taken forward, the transfer stations. It's all well and good on paper, but in reality, you're actually going to be able to implement those things and for them to be accepted. I think that's, yeah, it's not part of this, but yeah, it's a good point. Thanks.
Okay, so we ran out of time, but we are gonna still, for those of you that have more questions, take a couple of for a few minutes more. So you can ask any questions you have for any of the participants here. So please.
Sorry, just the last presentation touched on two cases that I've been working on, both Hanoi and SuSanA. And on the alternative, on some of the alternatives. For example, in SuSanA, this typical profile of many African cities, over 80% of people are dependent on site. So FSM is going to be absolutely vital. But it's an incredible political battle to get the institutions to agree on it. We, in fact, had a presentation not too long ago where the SuSanA claimed that they could, in 10 years, have the entire city covered by sewage. And the second issue that's related is I think, another institutional issue which somehow didn't come up so clearly. The whole issue about who should be responsible for sanitation. We talked about having responsibilities assigned, but like in South Asia, which is a place that I've before, the question about this local government or the utility, especially where utilities were created, they've got to work out the space with the local government that's often the one that's officially responsible. And it's a really, really almost impossible issue to go through it.
There on the back, maybe.
Yeah, my question is really to the stakeholder presentation and Niall's presentation on Freetown. And I'm just wondering if you two people were doing a joint presentation, maybe in reflection, whether Niall, your process would be any different, having heard what I've forgotten your name, I'm sorry. Philip, what Philip's approach to stakeholder engagement was, because Niall, you didn't mention much about stakeholders. And just reflecting, would there be anything different you would have done in your planning if you would have done sort of that stakeholder process that Philip discussed?
Yeah, I mean, I was presenting just the survey component to the project. It was a 6-month project which involved like wide stakeholder consultation and working alongside Freetown City Council, so with monthly stakeholder forums throughout that process. So there was a bit more to it, although maybe we hadn't gone through all of the phases that were Philippe shown in his presentation. But we covered a lot. We, like focus group discussions with private business and the various ministries. The Ministry of Health and Sanitation was on the steering committee for the project. So there was a more wider consultation which was included, but this was just the sort of civil society household part of that process.
Any more questions? People over there.
So this is a question, Ian Ross from Oxford Policy Management. This is a question mainly for Ruth. Go on, I've got some. So I've seen a longer version of your presentation before, but I'm wondering if this time, when I see it again, I've got a different kind of thought. So the data you presented on the different costs of emptying, the mechanical emptying was cheaper. Was that the financial cost of the household, or was that the overall economic cost of the service? That's one question. And secondly, if it is only the financial cost, then do you think if you took into account all the costs of the service as a whole, whether the data would be the same? And secondly, in the methodology section, you talked about the net present value data that you collected, and I may have missed it, but I don't remember seeing you present that this time, whereas I did see you present it a few months ago. So I'm wondering if you didn't, if I didn't not miss it, then maybe you can tell everyone a bit more about what you found using the net present value as your sort of outcome.
Okay, so the first part of your question, it was the it was the financial cost of this. It wasn't to the household, and as I said, it was just the components to basically the transportation, the capital and operation costs associated with the transfer station, then the vacuum tanker, and then the treatments, and then the reuse part of the train wasn't included, and also the containment, that component. So the rest of it was just the financial costs, and other economic costs weren't incorporated within that financial model. And the net present value, I think one of the graphs that I showed had the cost per household per month, and that's, I could probably go back to it. Yeah, sorry. That one. So yeah, the way we broke it down, I broke it down even. Net present value, US dollars per household per month, and then the line of affordability was based on 0.5% of the monthly household income overall, and it showed the variance. So obviously the brighter green is the motorised, using motorised primary transportation, so Bakito, and the kind of duller green is the the manual emptying. Sorry, but when we went back into the numbers, obviously you just need far greater amounts of equipment and staff, and that is reflected in that cost difference. Is that all the question? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to take the last question, if there is any. Okay. Well, I have a question myself for Philippe. I'd like to know, I mean, you mentioned the difficulties that you may contemplate to introduce this approach, this kind of approach, and matching it with the typical engineering process. So, what were the problems? I mean, how did you manage to overcome this issue with the authorities or the responsible of the project itself? How did you address this issue?
Well, I must say that in the particular case study of SoCo, where we developed this methodology, the aim was to reach this simplified methodology per se, but it was not fitted in parallel with engineering planning process of actual implementation. This came actually later, and it means that later on, especially for the development of the FSM book, I really tried to see and to deepen, like I said, this harmonization between those two approaches, which I find somehow is missing, and I really use now, it's kind of a basis for a framework, but I would be really willing to get feedback from you and further discussion on really how we can push those that are actually implementing the system, which are actually usually not in this kind of conferences, to include such a process. So I think it's still a living process, and I will be very eager for discussion.
Okay, so just please thank all the 4 presenters. And thank also to all of you for your energy, for being here to the very last minute, and we'll see you all tomorrow.